I sat in that sterile marble lobby watching my parents whisper with my sister Jessica about Grandpa Harold's $11 million fortune. Mom shot me a venomous look and muttered that I shouldn't even be here, since Harold always preferred Jessica anyway. Dad nodded smugly, reminding me that successful granddaughters inherit everything while disappointments get nothing. The mahogany doors opened, and Mr. Thompson, the estate lawyer, beckoned us inside. My stomach twisted as my parents confidently informed me I'd walk away empty-handed. Then he opened the will, read one sentence, and burst into uncontrollable laughter. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as we filed into Mr. Thompson's office, like mourners at a funeral I wasn't supposed to attend. Jessica smoothed her designer blazer and flashed that practiced smile she'd perfected since childhood, the one that convinced everyone she was the golden child worth investing in. My parents flanked her protectively, their body language screaming ownership and pride. Meanwhile, I tugged at my thrift store cardigan, feeling every bit the outsider they'd trained me to be. "Brandy, take that chair in the corner," Mom instructed without looking at me. "This won't take long for you anyway." The corner chair faced away from the massive oak desk where Mr. Thompson arranged his papers with methodical precision. From my position, I could barely see the legal documents that would determine everyone's financial future. It felt symbolic of my entire relationship with this family, always pushed to the margins, always watching important moments unfold from a distance. Dad cleared his throat importantly. "Before we begin, Mr. Thompson, I want to clarify that our daughter Brandy has never had much of a relationship with her grandfather. Harold made it quite clear over the years that Jessica was the granddaughter he connected with." Jessica dabbed her eyes with a tissue, though no tears had actually fallen. "Grandpa Harold and I were so close. We talked every week, and he was so proud of my marketing degree from Stanford. He always said education was the key to success." I bit my tongue, remembering how I'd worked 3 jobs just to afford community college, while Jessica's entire Stanford experience had been funded by family money. But this wasn't the moment to voice those bitter memories. This was their moment, their inheritance, their validation that I'd never measured up to their standards. Mr. Thompson adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and surveyed our family with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something flickered across his weathered features. Amusement, maybe, or anticipation. He'd been Harold's lawyer for over 30 years, handling everything from business contracts to family disputes. "Well then," he said slowly, "let's see what Harold wanted to say to all of you." The will was bound in leather with Harold's initials embossed in gold. Mr. Thompson opened it ceremoniously, and I caught a glimpse of Harold's distinctive handwriting in the margins. Even from my corner exile, I could see this wasn't a standard legal document. There were notes, additions, and what looked like very specific instructions written in Harold's careful script. "I, Harold Eugene Mitchell, being of sound mind and body." Mr. Thompson began, then stopped abruptly. His eyebrows shot up as he read something that made him chuckle. Then the chuckle became a laugh, and the laugh grew until he was practically wheezing with mirth. My parents exchanged confused glances. Jessica's perfectly composed expression cracked slightly, and I felt a flutter of something I hadn't experienced in years when it came to family matters, curiosity instead of dread. Mr. Thompson wiped his eyes with a handkerchief, still grinning. "Oh, Harold, you magnificent old fox. You really did think of everything, didn't you?" The lawyer's unexpected laughter hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. I'd spent 28 years believing my grandfather found me lacking a disappointment compared to Jessica's shining achievements. Growing up, every family gathering reinforced this hierarchy. Jessica at the head table, discussing her academic successes while I helped in the kitchen, invisible and unremarkable. I remember being 12 and winning the regional science fair with a project on renewable energy. I rushed home, clutching my blue ribbon, bursting to share the news with someone who might care. But Mom was on the phone with Harold describing Jessica's latest dance recital performance. When I tried to interrupt, she shooed me away and continued gushing about Jessica's natural grace and poise. "Harold thinks Jessica has real potential for professional dance," she'd said after hanging up. "He's considering funding private lessons with that instructor from Portland." My science fair ribbon ended up in a shoebox under my bed, never mentioned to Harold or anyone else who mattered. Throughout high school, this pattern continued relentlessly. Jessica received a new car for her 16th birthday, a gleaming silver Honda that Harold had personally selected. I got a used bicycle from a garage sale. When college applications came around, Harold enthusiastically funded Jessica's Stanford dreams, while I researched financial aid options alone in my room. "Community college is more practical for someone with your grades," Dad had explained when I dared ask about university possibilities. "Harold believes in investing where he'll see the best returns." Those words carved themselves into my soul. I wasn't worth investing in. I was a poor return on investment, a gamble not worth taking. So I worked at the local diner after school, saving every tip for my future, while Jessica attended SAT prep courses that Harold paid for without hesitation. The rejection letters from universities I couldn't afford stung less than the acceptance letters from schools I couldn't attend. But the deepest cut came when I overheard Mom telling Harold on the phone that I'd decided not to pursue higher education because I wasn't academically motivated. She'd never asked about my college plans. She'd simply assumed I had none worth discussing with Harold. Now sitting in this opulent law office, I wondered if any of those assumptions had been accurate. Mr. Thompson's continued amusement suggested something deeper was happening, something that contradicted everything my parents had taught me about my place in Harold's affections. "Mr. Thompson," Dad said impatiently, "perhaps you could explain what's so amusing about my father's final wishes." The lawyer composed himself, though his eyes still twinkled with barely suppressed mirth. "Oh, Robert, you're going to find this fascinating. But first, I should mention something that might surprise all of you. Harold specifically requested that Brandy be present for today's reading. In fact, he was quite insistent about it." A chill ran down my spine. Harold had requested my presence, but my parents had nearly left me at home, claiming the reading was only for family members who actually mattered to the deceased. "That's impossible," Mom protested. "Harold barely knew Brandy existed. She never made any effort to connect with him." "Never made any effort." Mr. Thompson's voice carried a sharp edge I hadn't heard before. "That's a fascinating perspective, Linda. Absolutely fascinating." He reached into a drawer and withdrew a thick file folder. "Before we continue with the will reading, I think we need to address some misconceptions about Harold's relationship with his granddaughter." Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "What kind of misconceptions?" "The kind that might affect how we interpret Harold's final wishes," Mr. Thompson replied cryptically. "You see, Harold came to me several months ago with some very specific concerns about family communication patterns. He'd begun to suspect that information wasn't flowing freely between family members." My heart hammered against my ribs. What did that mean? What kind of information? And why did Mr. Thompson keep glancing at me with something that looked almost like sympathy? "Now," he continued, "Harold's will contains some unusual provisions. He was quite clear that he wanted to understand the true nature of his family relationships before making his final dispositions. So he designed what he called character tests for each of you." Dad's face reddened. "Character tests? What kind of nonsense is that?" "The kind that reveals who people really are when they think no one important is watching," Mr. Thompson said quietly. "Harold was a very wise man, Robert. Much wiser than any of you gave him credit for." He opened the will again and flipped to a section marked with yellow sticky notes. "Each of you will receive specific tasks to complete over the next few days. These tasks will determine how Harold's estate gets distributed, and I can guarantee you the results are going to surprise everyone in this room." The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Whatever my parents had expected from today's meeting, it clearly wasn't this. And for the first time since entering this office, I found myself wondering if maybe, just maybe, Harold had seen more than anyone realized. Mr. Thompson straightened the papers with deliberate precision, his movement suggesting he was savoring what came next. The office felt smaller suddenly, as if the walls were closing in on secrets that had been buried too long. Harold's will wasn't just a legal document. It was a trap that had been 20 years in the making. Harold's estate, Mr. Thompson began formally, consists of $11.7 million in liquid assets, his primary residence on Cedar Hill Road valued at $1.8 million, the vacation cabin at Crater Lake worth $600,000, and his collection of vintage automobiles appraised at $400,000. Jessica's eyes widened at the numbers. Even I had to admit the total was staggering. Harold had been successful with his hardware store chain, but I'd never imagined this level of wealth. Additionally, the lawyer continued, there are the business assets. Mitchell Hardware operates 17 locations across Oregon and Washington, generating approximately $2.3 million in annual profit. The company's total valuation exceeds $12 million. Dad leaned forward greedily. So we're talking about roughly $26 million total. At minimum, Mr. Thompson confirmed. However, Harold has structured the inheritance in a very specific way. Rather than simple monetary distributions, he's created what he calls truth-revealing tasks for each family member. He pulled out 4 sealed envelopes, each marked with our names, in Harold's distinctive handwriting. Mine was noticeably thicker than the others, which sent a jolt of anxiety through my chest. Why would Harold have more instructions for me than for his beloved Jessica? These envelopes contain your individual assignments, Mr. Thompson explained. You have exactly 1 week to complete your tasks. Only after successful completion will you learn what Harold has bequeathed to you. Mom snatched her envelope impatiently. This is ridiculous. What kind of game was Harold playing? The kind where everyone finally tells the truth, Mr. Thompson replied with a meaningful look. Harold believed that families should be built on honesty, not convenient deceptions. The lawyer handed Jessica her envelope next, then Dad's. Finally, he approached my corner chair and presented mine with something that might have been a gentle smile. Brandy, your grandfather wanted me to tell you something before you open this. He said she's going to think this is another test she'll fail, but this time she's the one with all the answers. My hands trembled as I accepted the envelope. Harold's words delivered through his lawyer contained more kindness than my parents had shown me in years. But what did he mean about me having all the answers? Before anyone opens these, Mr. Thompson continued, I need to explain the ground rules Harold established. First, you must complete your tasks alone. No collaboration, no assistance, no sharing of information. Second, everything you discover during these tasks becomes part of Harold's final evaluation of your character. Third, dishonesty or attempts to circumvent the process will result in immediate disqualification from any inheritance. The room fell silent except for the tick of an antique clock on the lawyer's desk. These weren't simple tasks. They were trials designed to expose something Harold suspected about his family dynamics. What happens if we refuse to participate? Dad asked. Then you receive nothing, Mr. Thompson stated flatly. Harold was very clear about that. Participation is voluntary, but non-participation means complete disinheritance. Jessica clutched her envelope protectively. How do we know this is legitimate? Maybe you're manipulating his will for your own benefit. Mr. Thompson's expression hardened. Miss Mitchell, I've been practicing law for 42 years. My reputation is impeccable, and your grandfather trusted me completely. If you question the legitimacy of this process, you're welcome to hire your own attorney to observe. But the tasks remain mandatory for inheritance consideration. He moved behind his desk and activated a small recording device. Harold also insisted that I document your reactions to today's reading. He wanted everything on record. A chill ran through the room. Harold hadn't just planned an inheritance distribution. He'd orchestrated a comprehensive investigation into his family's true nature, and somehow I was a central player in whatever he'd discovered or suspected. Your tasks begin immediately, Mr. Thompson announced. You have until next Friday at 5 o'clock to complete them and return here for the final will reading. Harold's estate will be distributed based on what these tasks reveal about each of you." Dad stood abruptly. "This is insane. Harold was obviously not in his right mind when he created this circus." "Actually," Mr. Thompson said calmly, "I have documentation from 3 different physicians confirming Harold's complete mental competency right up until his death. He knew exactly what he was doing." As we filed out of the office, my parents whispered furiously to each other while Jessica clutched her envelope like a lifeline. But I walked in stunned silence, Harold's mysterious message echoing in my mind. I was the one with all the answers. What answers? What questions had Harold been asking that I didn't even know existed? The parking garage felt like a tomb as we separated toward our respective cars. Whatever Harold had planned, it was going to change everything. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't automatically assuming I'd be the one left disappointed. I drove home to my tiny studio apartment in a daze, Harold's envelope burning like a coal in my purse. My parents and Jessica had scattered immediately after leaving Mr. Thompson's office, each clutching their mysterious assignments. No one suggested grabbing coffee to discuss what had just happened. In our family, solidarity was reserved for maintaining facades, not confronting uncomfortable truths. My apartment reflected everything my family thought about my life choices. Functional, modest, unremarkable. The secondhand furniture told the story of someone who'd learned early that dreams were luxuries she couldn't afford. But tonight, sitting at my small kitchen table under the harsh fluorescent light, I felt something shifting in my chest. Harold's envelope was heavier than the others, sealed with old-fashioned red wax that bore his personal stamp. Inside, I found a handwritten letter on his personal stationery and a set of keys I didn't recognize. "My dear Brandy." The letter began in Harold's careful script. "If you're reading this, then the charade has finally ended and the truth can emerge from 28 years of shadows." My hands shook as I continued reading. "Your task is to visit my house and restore my old workshop in the basement. It's fallen into disrepair since my arthritis made the stairs difficult. You'll find everything you need in the tool shed behind the house. But more importantly, you'll find answers to questions you never knew you should ask." The letter included detailed directions to Harold's house on Cedar Hill Road, along with security codes and specific instructions for accessing the basement workshop. At the bottom, he'd written a postscript that made my throat tighten. "I'm sorry it took me so long to find a way around the barriers they built between us. You deserve so much better than the lies they fed you about your worth." Barriers. What barriers? Harold's words suggested he'd tried to connect with me but had been somehow prevented. But by whom, and why would my parents want to keep us apart? The next morning, I called in sick to my job at the insurance office and drove to Harold's house. I'd only been there twice in my life, both times for obligatory holiday gatherings where I'd felt like an unwelcome guest. The imposing Tudor-style home sat on 3 acres of meticulously landscaped grounds, its grandeur a stark reminder of the wealth gap between Harold's life and mine. Using the keys from the envelope, I let myself into the silent house. Everything smelled like lemon polish and the pipe tobacco Harold had favored. Family photos covered the mantelpiece, and I was struck by how many featured Jessica in various stages of her accomplished life. Dance recitals, graduation ceremonies, awards banquets, Jessica's success story told in carefully framed memories. I searched for photos of myself and found exactly 3. One from my 8th birthday party, one from my high school graduation, and one from what looked like a family Christmas when I was about 15. In each photo, I stood slightly apart from the group, my smile forced and uncomfortable. The basement stairs creaked under my weight as I descended into Harold's workshop. The space was indeed a disaster. Tools scattered everywhere, workbenches covered in dust and debris, half-finished projects abandoned mid-creation. It would take hours to restore this place to working condition. But as I began organizing Harold's tools, something felt wrong. These weren't the random results of neglect. Someone had deliberately ransacked this workshop searching for something specific. Drawers had been emptied hastily, their contents strewn across the floor. Tool cabinets hung open their interiors, obviously disturbed. I spent the morning sorting through the chaos, slowly beginning to see the method behind Harold's organizational system. He'd been a meticulous man who labeled everything and kept detailed inventories. As I worked, I began to notice patterns in the destruction. Whoever had searched this workshop had focused primarily on areas where Harold might have stored documents or personal papers. That's when I discovered the loose floorboard behind his main workbench. The board lifted easily, revealing a hidden compartment that had somehow escaped the searcher's attention. Inside, I found a metal box filled with papers, photographs, and what appeared to be copies of legal documents. My heart stopped when I saw my own name on several of the papers. Letters. Dozens of letters written in my childhood handwriting addressed to Grandpa Harold, with return addresses from our old house on Maple Street. Letters I'd never mailed because Mom had always said Harold was too busy to read children's correspondence. But these letters had been opened. Someone had read every word of my childish attempts to connect with my grandfather, and underneath them I found Harold's replies, responses he'd apparently written to each of my letters but had never been able to send. Dear Brandy, one began, I was so proud to hear about your science fair victory. I wish I could have been there to see your renewable energy project. Perhaps we could build something similar together in my workshop. Another read, your letter about wanting to learn carpentry warmed my heart. I have so many projects I'd love to share with someone who appreciates craftsmanship. Letter after letter revealed a grandfather who'd been eager to connect with me, who'd valued my interests and celebrated my small accomplishments. But somehow these letters had never reached me. And my letters to him had apparently never reached him either. At the bottom of the box, I found something that made my blood run cold. A legal document bearing my forged signature, formally declining Harold's offer to pay for my college education. I had never seen this document before. I had never declined Harold's offer because I had never received it. Someone had been intercepting our correspondence for years, systematically destroying any connection between Harold and me. And they'd forged my signature to make Harold believe I'd rejected his generosity. As I sat in that dusty workshop surrounded by evidence of a relationship that had been deliberately sabotaged, one question burned in my mind: who would benefit from keeping Harold and me apart? The answer, of course, was obvious. But the depth of the deception, the calculated cruelty of it, was just beginning to sink in. The hidden metal box contained enough evidence to rewrite my entire understanding of family dynamics. I spread the contents across Harold's workbench, like pieces of a puzzle I'd been trying to solve my whole life, without knowing the picture was supposed to exist. Harold's journal sat at the bottom of the box, leather-bound and filled with entries spanning the last 5 years of his life. The early entries revealed his growing frustration with what he perceived as my indifference toward him. Tried calling Brandy again today, he'd written 3 years ago. Linda says she's moved apartments and didn't leave a forwarding number. Strange that Jessica always knows how to reach her sister, but Brandy never responds to my messages. My stomach twisted. I'd lived in the same studio apartment for 4 years. I'd never moved, and I'd never received any messages from Harold. Another entry from 2 years ago. Brandy returned my birthday check uncashed with a note saying she doesn't need my charity. Linda explained that Brandy has become very proud and independent since finishing school. I'm hurt, but I respect her wishes. I had never received a birthday check from Harold. I had never returned anything uncashed. And I'd definitely never written a note calling his generosity charity. The journal entries painted a systematic campaign of deception that had convinced Harold I wanted nothing to do with him. Someone had been intercepting his attempts to contact me while simultaneously making him believe I was rejecting his overtures. But the most devastating discovery came in a manila folder marked Legal Correspondence. Inside, I found copies of multiple documents that should have changed my entire life trajectory. A letter from Harold offering to pay my full tuition to any university I could get accepted to. Another offering me a summer internship at his hardware store chain. a third inviting me to spend a month at his Crater Lake cabin to reconnect and plan your future. Every document bore my forged signature on rejection letters I'd never written. Dear Grandfather, one forgery read in handwriting that vaguely resembled mine. I appreciate your offer to pay for my education, but I've decided to make my own way in the world. I don't want to be dependent on family money. Another stated, thank you for the internship opportunity, but I'm not interested in the family business. I prefer to succeed based on my own merits, not nepotism. The cruelest forgery was attached to Harold's invitation to spend time at Crater Lake. I'm too busy with my own life to take a vacation. Please don't contact me about family activities anymore. Each forged rejection was written in a tone that would have deeply wounded Harold, cold, dismissive, and designed to make him believe I thought myself too good for his love and support. But who had created these elaborate deceptions? The handwriting analysis would require an expert, but the coordination suggested someone with regular access to both my mail and Harold's correspondence. Someone who knew enough about my life to create convincing explanations for my apparent rejection of his offers. I found my answer in Harold's most recent journal entries, written just months before his death. Robert came by today to discuss Jessica's graduate school funding. When I mentioned wanting to reach out to Brandy again, he became very agitated. He insists that Brandy has made her feelings clear and that pushing contact would only hurt everyone involved. Linda nodded along, saying Brandy has always been difficult about family relationships. The next entry was even more revealing. Something isn't adding up. Jessica mentioned that Brandy works at an insurance office downtown, but when I called the number Robert gave me, they said no one by that name had ever worked there. Why would Robert give me incorrect information about his own daughter's employment? Harold had begun to suspect the deception, and his suspicions had led him to investigate further. Hired a private investigator to locate Brandy's real address and phone number. If she truly doesn't want contact with me, I need to hear it from her directly, not through intermediaries who may have their own motivations. The investigator's report was tucked behind the journal, a 3-page document that confirmed Harold's worst fears. I had been living at the same address for years. I worked at Mutual Assurance on 3rd Street, not the fictional companies my parents had invented. And according to the investigator's interviews with my co-workers, I frequently expressed sadness about not having a relationship with my grandfather. The final journal entry was dated just 2 weeks before Harold's death. The truth is worse than I imagined. Robert and Linda have been systematically preventing any contact between Brandy and me for years. They forged documents, intercepted mail, and convinced me that my own granddaughter despises me. Why would parents sabotage their child's relationship with someone who wants to love and support her? Harold had discovered the conspiracy against us, but apparently he'd died before confronting my parents directly. Or had he? At the very back of the journal, I found a single page that made my hands shake. It was Harold's handwritten plan for what he called the truth test, a detailed strategy for exposing my parents' deception through his will and estate distribution. They think they've been clever, he'd written, but every lie they've told can be proven. Every forged document can be exposed. And when the time comes, Brandy will finally understand that she was loved and wanted all along. She deserves justice, and she deserves the inheritance they've been scheming to steal from her. Steal from me. What did that mean? Harold's words suggested my parents had been planning to exclude me from his will, entirely claiming I'd already rejected any relationship with him. I sat back on Harold's workshop stool, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the betrayal. My parents hadn't just damaged my relationship with Harold, they'd systematically stolen 20 years of love support and opportunities that he'd wanted to give me. The question now was, what were my parents and Jessica discovering during their own assigned tasks, and how much of the truth were they about to uncover about their own deceptions? While I processed the devastating evidence of my parents' betrayal, Jessica was struggling with her assigned task across town. Harold had instructed her to organize his business records and prepare a comprehensive financial summary for the estate lawyers. What should have been a straightforward assignment for someone with a Stanford business degree was turning into an absolute nightmare. Jessica had always excelled at presenting herself as competent and accomplished, but her actual skills had never been tested in real-world situations. Her marketing degree had been largely theoretical, and her few internships had involved more networking than actual work. Now faced with Harold's complex business documentation, she was drowning. The hardware store chain's records were stored in Harold's home office filing cabinets filled with decades of financial documents, tax records, supplier contracts, and employee files. Harold had been meticulous about record keeping, but he'd used an older organizational system that required patience and attention to detail to navigate. Jessica's first mistake was assuming she could simply scan everything into her laptop and let software sort it out automatically. She'd brought her expensive MacBook and a portable scanner, confident that technology would solve whatever challenges Harold's old-fashioned filing system presented. But Harold's records included handwritten notes, carbon copies, and documents that predated digital filing systems. The scanner couldn't interpret his annotations, and many of the financial relationships between documents weren't immediately obvious without understanding the business's evolution over time. After 6 hours of frustrating work, Jessica had managed to create a chaotic digital mess that bore no resemblance to Harold's carefully organized system. Files were mislabeled, documents were incomplete, and the financial relationships between different aspects of the business were completely obscured. That's when her impatience led to disaster. Desperate to make progress, Jessica decided to print everything from her laptop and reorganize the documents manually. She connected to Harold's wireless printer and sent several hundred pages to print simultaneously, not realizing that the printer was configured to print both sides of each page automatically. What emerged from the printer was a revealing mixture of Harold's legitimate business records and Jessica's own financial documents that had been stored on her laptop. Bank statements, credit card records, and transaction histories that Jessica had never intended to print were now scattered throughout Harold's business files. And these personal documents told a shocking story. For the past 2 years, Jessica had been systematically transferring money from Harold's business accounts into her own offshore banking accounts. The transactions were small enough to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts, but frequent enough to total over $200,000. Jessica's bank statements showed regular deposits that corresponded exactly with missing funds from the hardware store chain's operating accounts. She'd been using her access to Harold's financial information, gained through her parents' influence, to forge his signature on transfer authorizations. The embezzlement scheme was sophisticated enough to suggest Jessica hadn't planned it alone. The timing of the transfers coincided with Harold's increasing health problems, when he was less likely to scrutinize every financial detail personally, and the offshore accounts had been established using legal documents that bore Harold's forged signature. Jessica stared at the incriminating printouts in horror, realizing she'd just documented her own criminal activity. Her hands shook as she tried to gather the evidence, but it was too late. The documents were mixed throughout Harold's legitimate business records, and separating them would require going through every single page. As she frantically sorted through the papers, Jessica discovered another devastating problem. Harold's business records showed that he'd been tracking the missing funds for months. He'd hired a forensic accountant to investigate the discrepancies, and the accountant's preliminary report was filed with the other business documents. The report identified Jessica as the primary suspect in the embezzlement scheme. It included copies of security camera footage showing her accessing Harold's office after hours detailed analysis of the forged signatures and documentation of the offshore accounts that traced back to her personal information. Harold had known about Jessica's theft for at least 6 months before his death. He'd been building a case against her while pretending ignorance-gathering evidence that would eventually expose her crimes. But the most shocking discovery came when Jessica found Harold's personal notes about her embezzlement written in the margins of the forensic accountant's report. "Jessica's theft breaks my heart," he'd written, "but I'm not surprised. Robert and Linda raised her to believe she's entitled to anything she wants, regardless of who gets hurt. This is the natural result of their value system." Another note read, "I won't prosecute Jessica criminally while I'm alive because it would destroy the family. But my will must ensure that her crimes have consequences. She needs to understand that actions have results even when you think no one is watching." Jessica realized with growing panic that Harold's inheritance tasks weren't just about distributing his wealth. They were about exposing the truth of each family member's character. And her task had just revealed that she was a thief who'd been stealing from her dying grandfather. The sound of footsteps in the hallway made Jessica's blood freeze. Someone was approaching Harold's office. In her panic, she'd forgotten that the house's security system would alert the monitoring company when someone accessed the building after hours. Mr. Thompson's voice called out from the hallway, "Jessica, are you in the office? The security company called to report unusual activity." Jessica looked at the damning evidence scattered across Harold's desk. Bank statements showing her theft-forged documents bearing Harold's signature, and the forensic accountant's report that proved her grandfather had known about her crimes. There was no way to hide what she'd done. The truth was literally printed in black and white mixed throughout Harold's business records, like a confession she'd accidentally created. As Mr. Thompson's footsteps approached the office door, Jessica realized that Harold's inheritance test had just exposed her as a criminal. And unlike her previous mistakes, this one couldn't be covered up by her parents' protective lies. "My parents had received what seemed like the simplest task of all, sorting through Harold's personal belongings and preparing them for donation or family distribution. They'd approached the assignment with the same dismissive attitude they brought to most family responsibilities, viewing it as tedious busy work that needed to be completed quickly so they could claim their inheritance. Dad had grumbled about wasting a Saturday on Harold's nonsense, while Mom complained that going through a dead man's possessions was morbid and unnecessary. They'd arrived at Harold's house with empty boxes and garbage bags, planning to sort everything into 3 categories: valuable items, worth keeping sentimental objects for Jessica, and junk to be discarded. What they hadn't expected was that Harold's bedroom would reveal the depth of his suspicions about their behavior. Harold's master bedroom was a shrine to family history, with photographs spanning 6 decades covering every surface. But as my parents began boxing up his personal items, they noticed something that made them increasingly uncomfortable. Many of the recent family photos had been annotated in Harold's handwriting, with dates, locations, and what appeared to be fact-checking notes. Under a photo from Jessica's Stanford graduation, Harold had written, "Robert claims this cost $45,000, but Jessica told me it was $68,000. Why the discrepancy?" Next to a family Christmas photo from 3 years ago, he'd noted, "Linda says Brandy refused to attend because she was too busy with work, but Jessica mentioned Brandy was never invited. Need to verify which story is true." The annotations revealed that Harold had been systematically comparing the different versions of family events that my parents and Jessica had been telling him. He'd been documenting inconsistencies in their stories, tracking lies and contradictions with the methodical precision of a detective building a case. But the truly terrifying discovery came when Dad opened Harold's nightstand drawer. Inside, they found a sophisticated digital recording device with dozens of labeled memory cards dating back 2 years. Each card was marked with dates and cryptic notes like Robert Linda visit, inheritance discussion, and Jessica phone call, money request. Dad's hands shook as he realized what they'd found. Harold had been secretly recording their conversations during family visits, phone calls, and private discussions. And based on the number of memory cards, he'd been doing it extensively for years. Mom grabbed one of the memory cards and inserted it into Harold's bedside tablet. What they heard made their blood run cold. Their own voices filled the room, recorded during a visit 6 months before Harold's death. They were discussing their plans to convince Harold that I wanted nothing to do with him, ensuring that Jessica would inherit everything. Brandy's always been jealous of Jessica's success, Mom's recorded voice said clearly. It's better for everyone if Harold doesn't encourage her delusions about deserving equal treatment. Dad's voice responded, we need to make sure Harold understands that Brandy has made her choices. She's not family material like Jessica is. The recording continued with their detailed discussion of how they'd been intercepting Harold's attempts to contact me, forging my responses, and systematically poisoning his opinion of me to ensure I'd be excluded from his will. But that wasn't the worst part. As they continued listening, they heard themselves discussing Jessica's financial problems and her borrowing from Harold's business accounts. Not only had they known about Jessica's embezzlement, they'd encouraged it. Harold will never notice a few thousand here and there, Dad's voice said on the recording. He's getting older, less sharp with the details, and Jessica deserves compensation for all the time she spends managing his affairs. Mom's voice agreed. Besides, it's just an advance on her inheritance. We're not stealing anything that won't eventually be hers anyway. The recording documented their full knowledge of Jessica's theft and their active participation in covering it up. They'd helped her forge Harold's signatures, provided alibis for her unauthorized access to his office, and coached her on avoiding detection. As my parents listened to their own voices planning Harold's deception, they realized that Harold had known everything. Every lie they'd told, every document they'd forged, every relationship they'd sabotaged. It was all documented in devastating detail. But Harold's surveillance had captured even more than they'd imagined. Another memory card contained recordings of their private conversations about Harold's health and their impatience with his longevity. They discussed his medication schedule, speculated about when he might die, and even researched ways to expedite his decline without detection. He's 91, Dad's voice said on one recording. How much longer can he possibly hang on? Mom responded, the doctor says his heart medication could be adjusted. Maybe we should suggest he's experiencing more symptoms than he actually is. The recordings revealed that they'd been pressuring Harold's medical team to increase his medication dosages, claiming he was experiencing symptoms he'd never reported. They'd been actively trying to hasten his death while maintaining the appearance of concerned, loving family members. As they sat in Harold's bedroom, surrounded by evidence of their own cruelty and greed, my parents realized that Harold's inheritance tasks weren't just about testing their character. They were about exposing their crimes. Harold had known about the embezzlement, the forged documents, the intercepted correspondence, and their attempts to manipulate his medical care. He'd been gathering evidence for months, building a comprehensive case that documented every aspect of their betrayal. And now they understood why Mr. Thompson had been recording their reactions during the will reading. Harold had planned every detail of this revelation, ensuring that their shock and guilt would be documented when the truth finally emerged. The question now was, how much did Harold's will reveal about their crimes? And what consequences had he planned for the family members who'd spent years betraying his trust? Mr. Thompson's office felt different when we returned 3 days later for the second phase of Harold's inheritance process. The marble floors seemed colder, the mahogany furniture more imposing, and the air itself heavy with unspoken revelations. Each of us carried the weight of what we'd discovered during our assigned tasks, but none of us had shared our findings with the others. I arrived first clutching a folder containing photocopies of the evidence I'd found in Harold's workshop. The intercepted letters, forged documents, and Harold's journal painted a devastating picture of my parents' systematic deception. But I still didn't understand how deeply their betrayal ran or what Harold intended to do about it. Jessica arrived next looking haggard and nervous. Her usual polished appearance was disheveled, her designer clothes wrinkled, and her hands shook as she clutched her purse. Whatever she'd discovered during her business records task had clearly shaken her confidence. My parents entered together, their faces grim and their body language defensive. They avoided eye contact with everyone, including each other, and sat in chairs positioned as far from the rest of us as possible. The comfortable family unity they'd displayed during our first visit had completely evaporated. Mr. Thompson observed our changed dynamics with obvious satisfaction. Harold's plan was working exactly as he'd intended. The truth was emerging, and the family facade was crumbling under the weight of exposed deceptions. Before we proceed with the second phase, Mr. Thompson announced, "I want to share something Harold recorded specifically for this moment." He activated a large screen television mounted on his office wall. Harold's face appeared sitting in his familiar leather chair with his pipe and wearing the cardigan I remembered from family gatherings. "If you're watching this," Harold began, his voice strong despite his age, "then you've completed your assigned tasks and discovered some uncomfortable truths about our family dynamics." My parents shifted nervously in their chairs. Jessica clutched her purse tighter. "I want you to know," Harold continued, "that everything you found was intentionally placed for you to discover. The hidden documents, the recorded conversations, the financial discrepancies. I've been documenting the truth about this family for over 2 years." Harold leaned forward, his eyes seeming to look directly at each of us through the camera. "I installed security cameras throughout my house 6 months ago. Every task you completed, every reaction you had, every decision you made has been recorded and preserved." A chill ran through the room. Harold had been watching us during our most private moments of discovery, documenting our responses to learning the truth about each other. Brandy. Harold's image said, and I felt tears beginning to form, "You found the evidence of how your parents sabotaged our relationship. I want you to know that I loved you deeply and tried desperately to connect with you. They stole 20 years of our relationship, but they couldn't steal my respect for the strong, honest woman you became despite their cruelty." Harold's words hit me like a physical blow. This was the first time anyone in my family had acknowledged the damage that had been done to me, the opportunities that had been stolen, the love that had been deliberately prevented. Jessica. Harold continued, "Your task revealed the extent of your embezzlement and the offshore accounts you thought I didn't know about. Your parents helped you steal from me, convinced that my advancing age made me an easy target." Jessica's face went white as Harold enumerated the exact amounts she'd stolen, the dates of the transfers, and the methods she'd used to forge his signatures. Robert and Linda. Harold said, his voice hardening, "Your task exposed the recordings I made of your conversations about manipulating my medical care, hastening my death, and excluding Brandy from my will through systematic deception." My parents looked like they might be physically ill. Harold knew everything, every crime, every lie, every betrayal they'd committed over the years. "But here's what you don't know yet," Harold continued with a slight smile. "I've been working with federal investigators for the past 8 months. Everything you've done is being investigated by the FBI's Financial Crimes Division." The room fell completely silent except for the sound of Jessica's sharp intake of breath. The forged documents, the embezzled funds, the elder abuse, the medical manipulation. It's all been reported to the appropriate authorities. Your crimes have consequences even when you think your victim is too old or trusting to fight back. Harold's image shifted and his expression became more serious. "However, I believe in redemption and family even when family has failed me. The second phase of my inheritance process will give each of you an opportunity to take responsibility for your actions and make amends." Mr. Thompson paused the video and distributed 4 new envelopes, each significantly thicker than the first round. "These contain Harold's offers of redemption," the lawyer explained. "Each envelope includes a full confession document detailing your specific crimes and deceptions. Harold is offering each of you the opportunity to sign these confessions voluntarily and cooperate with the ongoing federal investigation." He leaned back in his chair, his expression stern. "If you sign the confessions and agree to make full restitution, Harold has arranged for reduced criminal charges and the possibility of avoiding prison time. If you refuse, the federal investigation will proceed without your cooperation, and you'll face the maximum penalties for your crimes." My parents and Jessica stared at their envelopes as if they contained poisonous snakes. "What about Brandy?" Dad asked desperately. "What's in her envelope?" Mr. Thompson smiled for the first time since we'd arrived. "Brandy's envelope contains something entirely different. Harold has some very specific plans for her future." I opened my envelope with trembling hands and found a letter that began, "My dearest Brandy, if you're reading this, then justice is finally being served, and you're about to learn exactly how much your grandfather loved you." The letter continued with Harold's detailed plans for my inheritance, but also something much more valuable: his complete faith in my character and his desire to give me the family business that my parents and Jessica had assumed would belong to them. Harold had been planning the ultimate reversal. The family members who'd betrayed him would face criminal consequences for their actions, while the granddaughter they'd tried to exclude would inherit everything they'd been scheming to steal. Harold's letter to me contained revelations that made my hands shake as I read. His plans for my future went far beyond simple monetary inheritance. He was offering me the chance to become the leader of an empire that my parents and Jessica had assumed would be theirs to control. Brandy. His letter continued. "Mitchell Hardware isn't just a chain of stores. It's a legacy built on honest work, fair dealing, and treating customers like family. For 47 years, I've grown this business from a single storefront into the most trusted hardware retailer in the Pacific Northwest." Harold described the company's financial position in detail. The 17 stores generated over $2 million in annual profit, but Harold had been conservative in his growth strategy, focusing on sustainable expansion rather than aggressive acquisition. He'd identified opportunities for growth that could triple the company's value within 5 years. "I need a successor who shares my values," the letter explained. "Someone who understands that business success means nothing if it's built on deception and exploitation. Your parents and Jessica see the hardware stores as assets to be monetized. You, I believe, would see them as communities to be served." Harold had been watching my work ethic and character development from a distance, despite my parents' efforts to keep us apart. Through his private investigator, he'd learned about my dedication to my insurance job, my reputation for honesty among my coworkers, and my volunteer work at the community center teaching financial literacy to elderly residents. "Your parents convinced you that I found you lacking," Harold wrote, "but the truth is that you're the only family member who's shown the qualities necessary to lead a business built on trust." The letter detailed Harold's transition plan. If I accepted his offer, I would immediately inherit 51% ownership of Mitchell Hardware, with the remaining shares held in a trust that would gradually transfer to me over the next decade as I proved my leadership capabilities. But Harold's offer came with conditions that revealed the true genius of his plan. To inherit the business, his letter explained, "You must demonstrate that you've learned from your family's betrayal by standing up to their manipulation publicly. Tomorrow in Mr. Thompson's office, you must confront your parents about their systematic deception and demand that they confess their crimes to federal investigators." Harold wasn't just offering me a business, he was requiring me to break the cycle of family dysfunction that had defined my entire life. For 28 years, I'd accepted my parents' version of reality, believing their claims that I was disappointing, unsuccessful, and unworthy of love or investment. "If you can find the courage to call out their lies," Harold continued, "you'll prove that you have the strength necessary to lead a company that employs over 300 people. Business leadership requires the ability to confront difficult truths, even when it costs us relationships we thought we valued." The letter included detailed financial projections, showing how Mitchell Hardware could expand into home improvement consulting, online retail, and contractor supply services. Harold had identified market opportunities worth millions of dollars, but implementing these plans would require someone with both business acumen and unshakable integrity. "Your Stanford-educated sister has impressive credentials," Harold wrote, "but credentials don't create character. Jessica has proven that she'll steal from family members when she thinks she can get away with it. That's not someone I trust to honor contracts with customers, suppliers, and employees. Harold explained that he'd originally hoped Jessica might be worthy of the business inheritance, which was why he'd funded her expensive education. But Jessica's entitlement and willingness to commit crimes had convinced him that she lacked the ethical foundation necessary for business leadership. Your parents raised Jessica to believe she deserves whatever she wants, regardless of who gets hurt in the process. They raised you to believe you deserve nothing, regardless of how hard you work or how honestly you conduct yourself. Ironically, their cruelty toward you created exactly the character traits I need in a business successor. The letter concluded with Harold's most direct challenge yet. Tomorrow, when you confront your family about their deceptions, you'll be choosing between two different futures. You can continue accepting their version of reality, in which case you'll receive a modest financial inheritance, but nothing more. Or you can demand the truth and claim your rightful place as the leader of Mitchell Hardware. Harold had structured the inheritance to force me into a moment of reckoning that would define the rest of my life. If I found the courage to confront decades of family manipulation, I would inherit not just wealth, but the opportunity to build something meaningful. But if I remained the quiet, accommodating daughter who avoided family conflicts, I would prove that I wasn't ready for the responsibilities of business leadership. As I finished reading Harold's letter, I realized that tomorrow's confrontation wasn't really about inheritance or money. It was about whether I had the strength to finally stop being the victim of my family's lies and start being the protagonist of my own story. The question was, after 28 years of conditioning, did I have the courage to fight back when it mattered most? That night, I sat in my small apartment staring at Harold's letter and the mountain of evidence I'd collected from his workshop. Tomorrow would either be the day I finally stood up to my family's decades of manipulation, or the day I proved I wasn't strong enough to claim the life Harold believed I deserved. I spread the documents across my kitchen table like battle plans. The intercepted letters proved my parents had systematically sabotaged my relationship with Harold. The forged documents showed they'd stolen opportunities for education and mentorship that could have changed my entire life trajectory. And Harold's journal revealed that he'd loved me deeply while being convinced by their lies that I rejected him. But as I prepared for tomorrow's confrontation, I discovered that my family's betrayal ran even deeper than I'd realized. Hidden in my laptop bag, I found a small recording device that I didn't remember placing there. When I played it back, I heard my own voice from 3 days ago talking to myself as I processed the shocking discoveries in Harold's workshop. But I also heard something else, the sound of my apartment door opening and closing while I was at work. Someone had been in my apartment while I was gone. I checked my laptop's browser history and found searches I hadn't made: how to discredit will inheritance, challenging grandfather's mental competency, and proving inheritance fraud. Someone had been using my computer to research ways to contest Harold's estate distribution. The realization hit me like ice water. My family wasn't just planning to deny their crimes, they were preparing to frame me for them. I called my building's security office and requested the hallway camera footage from the past 3 days. The security guard, someone I'd chatted with regularly for years, agreed to let me review the recordings. What I saw in the footage made my stomach turn. My father had entered my apartment building yesterday afternoon using what appeared to be a key. He'd spent 47 minutes in my apartment, long enough to plant evidence-install recording devices, or set up whatever plan they'd devised to escape the consequences of their actions. But that wasn't the worst part. The security footage also showed my mother and Jessica entering the building this morning, just 2 hours after I'd left for Harold's house. They'd stayed for over an hour, and when they left, Jessica was carrying a manila folder that she hadn't brought in. They'd stolen some of my evidence. I frantically checked my apartment and discovered that several of the most damning documents were missing. The forged college rejection letter with my signature was gone. 3 of Harold's undelivered letters to me had vanished, and most critically, Harold's journal entry describing how he'd discovered their deception was nowhere to be found. My family had broken into my apartment and stolen the evidence that would prove their crimes. But they'd also left something behind. On my computer, I found a document they'd created using my login credentials. It was a detailed confession claiming that I had forged Harold's signature on various financial documents, embezzled money from his business accounts, and manipulated him into changing his will in my favor. The fake confession was sophisticated enough to be convincing, complete with fabricated dates, amounts, and methods that would be difficult to disprove without Harold's original documentation. They'd even included details about my supposed motivation, jealousy of Jessica's success, and resentment about being excluded from family wealth. My parents were planning to claim that Harold's entire inheritance scheme was my manipulation of a vulnerable elderly man. They would present themselves as the victims of my deception, while I faced criminal charges for crimes they'd actually committed. The elegant cruelty of their plan was breathtaking. They would escape consequences for their actual crimes by framing me for identical crimes, using their theft of Harold's evidence to support their false accusations. But as I sat in my apartment surrounded by the remaining evidence of their betrayal, I realized that my family had made a critical mistake. They'd assumed that Harold had only hidden evidence in his workshop, not knowing about the security cameras he'd installed throughout his house. They didn't know that everything they'd done during their assigned tasks had been recorded and preserved. And they definitely didn't know that Harold's will contained provisions specifically designed to protect me from exactly this kind of retaliation. I opened Harold's letter again and found a section I'd missed during my initial reading. Brandy. It said, "Your parents will try to frame you for their crimes when they realize they've been caught. I've anticipated this response because it's entirely consistent with their character. They've spent your entire life making you the scapegoat for their failures, and they won't change that pattern now." Harold had planned for my family's final betrayal, and tomorrow's confrontation wasn't just about claiming my inheritance. It was about exposing their last desperate attempt to destroy me rather than accept responsibility for their actions. The question now was whether I had the strength to walk into that law office, knowing they were planning to sacrifice me to save themselves, and still find the courage to demand the truth. I walked into Mr. Thompson's office the next morning, carrying a briefcase containing what remained of Harold's evidence and a digital recorder I'd purchased at dawn. If my family wanted to play games with truth and deception, I was done being their victim. My parents and Jessica were already seated when I arrived, their body language radiating false confidence. They'd clearly rehearsed their performance overnight, positioning themselves as the wronged parties who discovered my supposed crimes against Harold. "Before we begin," Dad announced pompously, "we need to discuss some disturbing evidence we've uncovered about Brandy's manipulation of my father." Mr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "What kind of evidence?" Mom pulled out a folder containing the fabricated confession they'd planted on my computer. "We found documentation proving that Brandy has been systematically deceiving Harold, forging his signature, and embezzling money from his business accounts." Jessica nodded tearfully. "We're heartbroken to discover that our own family member would take advantage of an elderly man's trust this way." I watched this performance with growing fury. After 28 years of their gaslighting and manipulation, they were attempting one final assault on my sanity and reputation. They expected me to crumble under their accusations, to retreat into the familiar role of the family scapegoat who accepted blame for everyone else's failures. Instead, I stood up and faced them directly. "You lying, manipulative thieves," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the silent office. "I know exactly what you've done, and I'm not going to let you frame me for your crimes." Dad's face reddened. "How dare you speak to your parents that way? We have proof of your deception right here." "You have proof that you broke into my apartment and planted fake evidence," I replied, pulling out my digital recorder. "Everything you've done in the past week has been documented, including your illegal entry into my home." I activated the recorder and played the apartment building's security footage audio, which clearly captured Dad using a key to enter my building, and Mom discussing their plan to make sure Brandy takes the fall for everything. Mr. Thompson leaned forward with intense interest. "Please continue, Brandy." "For 28 years, I said, my voice growing stronger, these people have systematically destroyed every opportunity Harold tried to give me. They intercepted his letters, forged my responses, and convinced him that I rejected his love and support. I opened my briefcase and began laying out the evidence I'd managed to preserve. Harold's journal entries, copies of the forged documents, and photographs of the hidden compartment in his workshop. Harold offered to pay for my college education," I continued. "They forged a rejection letter using my signature. He invited me to spend summers at his cabin learning about the family business. They created fake responses claiming I was too busy and uninterested." Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "That's impossible. Grandpa never mentioned offering you anything." "Because you've been stealing from him for 2 years, I shot back. "The business records you were supposed to organize documented your embezzlement of over $200,000 from his store accounts." The color drained from Jessica's face as I described the exact amounts, dates, and methods of her theft. Mr. Thompson was taking detailed notes, and I could see him cross-referencing my accusations with documents from his own files. "And you," I said, turning to my parents, "have been recording as accomplices to elder abuse. Harold's security system captured your conversations about manipulating his medical care and hastening his death." "You can't prove any of this," Mom said desperately, but her voice lacked conviction. "Actually," Mr. Thompson interjected, "I can. Harold provided me with comprehensive documentation of everything Brandy has described. The FBI has been investigating this family for 8 months. The room fell silent except for the sound of Jessica's increasingly rapid breathing. "Harold suspected your deceptions," I continued, "so he created an inheritance process designed to expose the truth. Every task you completed was monitored and recorded. Your crimes are documented beyond any possibility of denial. Dad made one last desperate attempt to maintain control. Even if some of what you're saying is true, it doesn't change the fact that you're clearly mentally unstable. No court will believe the accusations of someone who's obviously having a psychological breakdown." That's when Jessica broke. "Stop it," she screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Just stop lying. She's telling the truth about everything." My parents stared at Jessica in shock as she dissolved into sobs. "I did steal the money," Jessica confessed through her tears. "I forged Grandpa's signatures and transferred funds to offshore accounts, and you knew about it. You helped me do it." Mom reached for Jessica's arm. "Honey, you don't know what you're saying." "Yes, I do." Jessica pulled away violently. "I'm tired of pretending. I'm tired of lying. I'm tired of letting Brandy take the blame for everything we've done wrong." Jessica turned to face me directly, her makeup streaked with tears. "I'm sorry, Brandy. I'm so sorry for everything. You never deserved the way we treated you." The confession continued pouring out of Jessica like water from a broken dam. She described not only the financial theft, but also the medical manipulation they'd pressured her to participate in. "They made me increase Grandpa's medication dosages," she sobbed. "They said it would help him be more comfortable, but I know they just wanted him to become confused so he wouldn't notice the missing money." Mr. Thompson was writing frantically, documenting every word of Jessica's breakdown. "And the letters," Jessica continued. "I helped them intercept your correspondence with Grandpa. I felt terrible about it, but they said you were better off without his influence because he was too controlling." I stared at my sister, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time in our lives. Underneath the golden child facade, Jessica was as much a victim of our parents' manipulation as I was. They'd used her greed and insecurity to turn her into a criminal, just as they'd used my isolation and self-doubt to turn me into a scapegoat. "They made me believe that hurting you was protecting the family," Jessica whispered. "But it wasn't protection. It was cruelty, and I was too selfish and scared to stop it." My parents sat in stunned silence as their carefully constructed web of deceptions collapsed around them. Their golden child had just confessed to crimes they'd all committed together, destroying any possibility of escaping consequences through denial or manipulation. The truth had finally erupted, and there was no putting it back in the bottle. Mr. Thompson reached for his phone as Jessica's confession continued, but he didn't need to make any calls. The office door opened, and 3 people in dark suits entered the room with the quiet authority of federal agents. Special Agent Martinez, FBI Financial Crimes Division. The lead agent announced, showing her credentials. We've been monitoring this meeting as part of an ongoing investigation into elder abuse and financial fraud. My parents' faces went white as they realized that Harold's inheritance process hadn't just been about family dynamics. It had been a carefully orchestrated law enforcement operation. Harold Mitchell contacted our office 8 months ago. Agent Martinez explained, with evidence of systematic financial exploitation and elder abuse, he agreed to cooperate with our investigation by documenting ongoing crimes and gathering evidence of your criminal conspiracy. She gestured to a small device mounted discreetly in the corner of Mr. Thompson's office. Everything that's happened here today has been recorded with full legal authority. Ms. Jessica Mitchell's confession will be used as evidence in federal prosecution. Agent Martinez opened a briefcase containing thick files labeled with each family member's name. Harold's cooperation allowed us to build comprehensive cases against each of you. The forged documents, financial theft, medical manipulation, and conspiracy to defraud an elderly person are all federal crimes with severe penalties. Dad found his voice first. This is entrapment. You can't use evidence gathered through deception. Actually, Agent Martinez replied calmly, elderly victims have the legal right to cooperate with law enforcement investigations into their own abuse. Harold's consent makes all of this evidence completely admissible in court. She pulled out documents from each file, spreading them across Mr. Thompson's conference table like evidence in a courtroom. Robert and Linda Mitchell, you're facing federal charges for elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, mail fraud, and attempting to manipulate medical care with intent to cause harm. The recordings from Harold's house document your criminal conspiracy in detail. Agent Martinez turned to Jessica. Jessica Mitchell, your confession today confirms our existing evidence of embezzlement, forgery, and conspiracy to defraud. However, your cooperation will be factored into any plea negotiations. I sat in stunned silence as the full scope of law enforcement involvement became clear. Harold hadn't just been gathering evidence for his will. He'd been building a federal case against the family members who'd betrayed him. Mr. Thompson, Agent Martinez continued, has been cooperating with our investigation as Harold's legal representative. The inheritance process was designed to give each suspect an opportunity to confess voluntarily and cooperate with federal authorities. Mr. Thompson nodded gravely. Harold hoped that facing the truth about their actions might inspire genuine remorse and cooperation. He believed in redemption, even for people who deeply wronged him. Agent Martinez opened my parents' files and began reading charges that carried potential prison sentences of up to 20 years. The evidence was overwhelming. Recorded conversations, financial documents, medical records, and now Jessica's complete confession. However, she continued, Harold's will includes provisions for reduced sentences in exchange for full cooperation, complete restitution, and genuine acceptance of responsibility for your crimes. She handed each of them formal plea agreement documents. If you sign these agreements, acknowledge your guilt, and cooperate fully with our ongoing investigation, Harold arranged for minimum sentences with focus on restitution rather than extended prison time. Dad scanned the document with trembling hands. What does full cooperation mean exactly? It means confessing to every crime you've committed against Harold, providing complete financial disclosure for restitution calculations, and testifying against any other individuals who may have assisted your criminal activities, Agent Martinez explained. The plea agreements offered my parents and Jessica a path to avoid decades in federal prison, but only if they completely abandoned any attempts to deny or minimize their crimes. The alternative, Agent Martinez added, is a federal trial where you'll face maximum sentences for each charge. Given the strength of our evidence and today's recorded confessions, conviction is virtually guaranteed. Jessica was the first to reach for a pen. "I want to sign," she said quietly. "I want to confess everything and try to make this right." "Jessica, don't say anything more without a lawyer," Mom pleaded. "I don't want a lawyer," Jessica replied firmly. "I want to tell the truth. For once in my life, I want to do the right thing." Agent Martinez witnessed Jessica's signature on the plea agreement, then read her constitutional rights as she formally confessed to every aspect of her crimes against Harold. My parents watched in horror as their daughter chose honesty over family loyalty, cooperation over conspiracy, and justice over protection. Harold believed, Mr. Thompson said quietly, that even people who'd committed serious crimes could choose redemption if they found the courage to accept responsibility for their actions. Jessica is proving him right. Agent Martinez turned to my parents. "You have 24 hours to decide whether to sign plea agreements or proceed to federal trial. But understand that every hour you delay reduces the government's willingness to offer lenient terms." As the FBI agents prepared to leave with Jessica's signed confession, I realized that Harold's plan was working exactly as he'd intended. The family members who'd betrayed him were facing real consequences for their actions, but they also had opportunities for redemption if they chose honesty over continued deception. The question now was whether my parents would follow Jessica's example and accept responsibility, or whether they would continue fighting until they faced the maximum penalties their crimes deserved. As the FBI agents escorted Jessica out to begin her formal debriefing, Mr. Thompson turned his attention to documents that would reshape my understanding of Harold's true legacy. The business empire he'd built was far more extensive and valuable than anyone had realized. Brandy. Mr. Thompson said, spreading financial reports across his desk, "It's time you learned about the full scope of what Harold is offering you." The Mitchell hardware chain represented only the visible portion of Harold's business interests. Over the past 20 years, he'd been quietly acquiring commercial real estate across 3 states, purchasing properties that housed not just his own stores, but also shopping centers, office buildings, and industrial facilities. Harold owned the land under 47 different businesses. Mr. Thompson explained, pointing to property deeds and lease agreements. He was one of the largest commercial landlords in the Pacific Northwest, generating over $4 million annually in rental income alone. But that wasn't the most valuable part of his empire. Harold had also been an inventor holding patents on 17 different construction and hardware innovations that were licensed to major manufacturers nationwide. The royalty payments from these patents generated an additional $3 million per year, and several of the patents wouldn't expire for another decade. "Your grandfather," Mr. Thompson continued, "was essentially a genius who disguised himself as a simple hardware store owner. He understood that visible wealth attracts attention and potential exploitation, so he structured his empire to appear smaller than it actually was. The financial documents painted a picture of a man who'd built sustainable wealth through intelligence, hard work, and strategic thinking. Unlike inherited money or quick profits, Harold's empire was designed to grow and provide value for generations. The total value of Harold's business interests exceeds $52 million, Mr. Thompson announced, and according to his will, all of it goes to you contingent on your successful completion of today's confrontation." I stared at the numbers, struggling to comprehend the magnitude of what Harold was offering. This wasn't just inheritance. It was the opportunity to become one of the most successful business people in the region. But Harold's bequest came with detailed plans for growth and expansion that revealed the true scope of his vision. He spent the last 5 years developing comprehensive business plans for doubling the empire's value within a decade. Mr. Thompson explained, opening thick folders containing market research expansion strategies and financial projections. Harold had identified opportunities in sustainable building materials, online retail integration, contractor education programs, and franchise expansion that could transform Mitchell Hardware from a regional chain into a national brand. However, Mr. Thompson continued, Harold understood that managing this empire would require skills you don't currently possess, so he's arranged for you to receive intensive business training from some of the most successful entrepreneurs in the country. The training program included executive education at top business schools, mentorship from industry leaders, and a gradual transition plan that would give me 5 years to develop the expertise necessary for full leadership responsibility. Harold also established a board of advisors. Mr. Thompson added, consisting of his most trusted business associates, legal experts, and financial managers. They'll provide guidance and oversight during your transition to full ownership. But perhaps the most meaningful part of Harold's plan was his vision for the empire's social impact. Your grandfather wanted Mitchell Hardware to become a model for ethical business practices, Mr. Thompson explained. He's established funds for employee profit-sharing community development grants and educational scholarships that will demonstrate how successful businesses can strengthen entire communities. Harold had included detailed plans for hiring practices that prioritize character over credentials, employee development programs that helped workers build careers rather than just jobs and community partnerships that would make Mitchell Hardware stores centers of local economic development. The empire Harold built, Mr. Thompson said, represents more than financial success. It's a demonstration that businesses can be profitable while also being forces for good in the world. But the most surprising revelation came when Mr. Thompson opened Harold's personal letter about family legacy. Harold wrote this specifically for you, he said, handing me a sealed envelope. He wanted you to understand why he chose you over the family members who seemed more obvious choices for business succession. Inside, Harold had written a detailed analysis of the character traits necessary for ethical business leadership. He'd observed my work ethic, honesty, compassion for others, and ability to persevere through adversity despite my family's treatment. Jessica has impressive academic credentials. Harold had written, but she's proven that she'll steal when she thinks she won't get caught. That's not someone I trust to honor contracts with employees, customers, and suppliers. He'd analyzed my parents' character with equal clarity. Robert and Linda are motivated entirely by self-interest and willing to harm anyone, including their own daughter, to protect their advantages. They would destroy this business within 5 years through greed and poor judgment. Harold's letter concluded with his most direct statement about why he'd chosen me. You've spent 28 years being told you're not good enough, smart enough, or valuable enough to deserve opportunities. But adversity revealed your true character. You remained honest, hardworking, and kind despite having every reason to become bitter and cruel. Those are the qualities I need in someone who will represent my life's work. As I finished reading Harold's letter, I realized that inheriting his business empire wasn't just about receiving wealth. It was about accepting responsibility for honoring the values he'd spent a lifetime building into his companies. The question now was whether I had the strength and vision to transform Harold's legacy into something even greater than he'd imagined. 24 hours later, my parents returned to Mr. Thompson's office, but their demeanor had completely changed. The confident arrogance they'd displayed during our first meeting had been replaced by desperate fear as they faced the reality of federal prosecution. "We need to talk to Brandy," Dad said without preamble, privately. Agent Martinez, who had remained to oversee the plea agreement process, nodded toward a smaller conference room. "You have 15 minutes for family discussion before we proceed with formal proceedings." My parents ushered me into the adjacent room and closed the door, their faces showing a combination of panic and what might have been genuine remorse. "Brandy." Mom began, her voice shaking. "We need you to understand that everything we did was meant to protect you." I stared at her in disbelief. Even facing federal charges, they were still attempting to manipulate the narrative. "Protect me from what?" I asked. From having a loving relationship with my grandfather, from getting a college education, from building a career in the family business. Dad stepped forward with his hands raised in a placating gesture. Harold was controlling Honey. We've seen how he manipulated business partners and employees over the years. We didn't want him to do the same thing to you. So you decided to control me instead, I replied flatly. You made that choice for me without ever asking what I wanted or telling me the truth about Harold's offers. Mom tried a different approach. We made mistakes, serious mistakes, but we're still your parents and we love you. Doesn't that count for anything? The question hung in the air between us, and I realized this was the moment I'd been unconsciously preparing for my entire life. Did their biological relationship to me excuse 28 years of systematic emotional abuse and manipulation? Love doesn't steal opportunities from the people you claim to care about, I said quietly. Love doesn't forge someone's signature to reject educational funding. Love doesn't systematically sabotage relationships and then lie about it for decades. Dad's facade cracked completely. Look, we can't change what happened, but we can make it right. If you testify on our behalf, tell the court that we were trying to protect you from Harold's manipulation, maybe we can avoid prison time. And there it was, their final manipulation attempt. They wanted me to perjure myself in federal court to help them escape consequences for crimes they definitely committed. You want me to lie to federal agents, I said, to protect you from facing consequences for lying to me for 28 years. It's not lying, Mom insisted. It's family loyalty. It's standing by the people who raised you and sacrificed for you. What sacrifices? I demanded. You sacrificed nothing for me. You took every opportunity Harold offered and gave it to Jessica instead. You sacrificed my relationship with my grandfather to maintain your control over family dynamics. Dad's voice hardened as he realized their emotional manipulation wasn't working. Fine, be ungrateful, but remember that we're the ones who'll be here for you when Harold's money runs out and you realize you're not smart enough to manage a business empire. His words revealed everything I needed to know about their definition of family love. It was conditional controlling and designed to keep me dependent on their approval. Actually, I said, standing to leave, Harold's money won't run out because I'm smart enough to hire excellent advisors, honest enough to maintain customer trust, and hardworking enough to grow the business rather than exploit it. Mom made one last desperate attempt. Brandy, please. We're your parents. We gave you life. You gave me birth, I corrected. But Harold gave me something far more valuable. He showed me what unconditional love and support actually look like. Even when you convinced him I'd rejected him, he never stopped hoping we could have a relationship. I moved toward the door, then turned back for one final statement. I spent my entire life believing your version of reality, that I was disappointing, unworthy, and lucky to be tolerated by my own family. But Harold's evidence proved that you were lying about everything, including my worth as a person. Dad's face reddened with anger. You'll regret this decision when you realize how lonely success can be without family support. I'll never be as lonely as I was when I believed my own family thought I was worthless, I replied. And I'll never be as isolated as you're going to be when you're serving federal prison sentences for elder abuse. As I reached for the door handle, Mom called out desperately, What about Jessica? Will you at least help your sister? I paused, considering Jessica's tearful confession and her apparent genuine remorse for the crimes she'd committed. Jessica chose honesty over family loyalty yesterday, I said. She's facing consequences for her actions, but she's also taking responsibility for them. That's more courage than either of you have shown. When we returned to the main conference room, my parents' body language told Agent Martinez everything she needed to know about our family discussion. Will you be signing the plea agreements? She asked. Mom and Dad exchanged glances, then Dad shook his head. We're going to need lawyers. That's your right, Agent Martinez replied, but understand that refusing cooperation will result in maximum penalty prosecution for all federal charges. As my parents were led away to begin the legal process that would likely result in lengthy prison sentences, I realized that their final manipulation attempt had actually freed me from any remaining guilt about their situation. They'd had every opportunity to choose honesty, responsibility, and genuine family reconciliation. Instead, they'd chosen continued manipulation and attempts to escape consequences for their crimes. Harold had been right. Redemption was available to anyone willing to accept responsibility for their actions. My parents had chosen a different path, and they would face the results of that choice alone. 6 months later, I stood in the executive office of Mitchell Hardware's flagship store, looking out at a business empire that was finally living up to Harold's vision of ethical success. The transformation had been more challenging than I'd ever imagined, but also more rewarding than Harold's most optimistic projections. Jessica had served 4 months in a minimum security federal facility and was now participating in a supervised restitution program that allowed her to work as a junior accountant while paying back the money she'd stolen from Harold. Her plea agreement had resulted in the lightest sentence possible, and she'd used her time in confinement to earn certifications in business ethics and nonprofit management. "I want to do something meaningful with my life," she'd told me during one of our monthly coffee meetings. "Something that helps people instead of hurting them." Our parents, however, had received the maximum sentences their crimes deserved. Dad was serving 8 years for elder abuse and financial fraud, while Mom received 6 years for conspiracy and mail fraud. They'd refused every opportunity for plea agreements, maintaining their innocence even when faced with overwhelming evidence of their guilt. Their trials had been extensively covered in local media, serving as cautionary tales about the consequences of elder abuse and family financial exploitation. The publicity had been painful, but it had also brought dozens of other families forward to report similar crimes against elderly relatives. Mitchell Hardware had become the centerpiece of a business empire that now employed over 400 people across 23 locations. But more importantly, it had become a model for the kind of ethical business practices Harold had always envisioned. I'd implemented profit-sharing programs that gave every employee a stake in the company's success. We'd established educational partnerships with local community colleges to provide career training in construction trades and business management, and we'd created a foundation that provided small business loans to entrepreneurs who prioritized community development over pure profit. The financial results had exceeded Harold's most optimistic projections. By focusing on customer service, employee development, and community partnership, we'd grown annual revenue by 37% while maintaining the highest customer satisfaction ratings in the region. But perhaps the most meaningful transformation had been personal. For the first time in my life, I was surrounded by people who valued my judgment, respected my decisions, and supported my goals. The board of advisors Harold had assembled treated me as a legitimate business leader whose opinions mattered. Employees throughout the company came to me with ideas, concerns, and suggestions because they knew I'd listen and respond thoughtfully. The isolation and self-doubt that had defined my first 28 years had been replaced by confidence and purpose. I discovered that Harold had been right about my character. I did possess the qualities necessary for ethical business leadership. The hardest part of the transformation had been learning to trust my own judgment after decades of conditioning, to defer to others' opinions. Harold's business advisors had been patient but firm in encouraging me to make my own decisions, even when those decisions involved significant financial risks. "Harold chose you specifically because you think differently than your family," one advisor had explained during a particularly challenging expansion decision. "Trust the instincts that made him confident in your leadership ability." I'd also established new traditions that honored Harold's memory while building toward the future he'd envisioned. Every Mitchell Hardware store now displayed a plaque describing Harold's commitment to community service and ethical business practices. We'd created an annual scholarship program for students pursuing business education with special preference given to young people from dysfunctional families who'd overcome adversity through their own efforts. Most meaningfully, I'd restored Harold's workshop in the basement of his house, which I'd inherited along with the business empire. The space had become a place where I could work with my hands, think through complex problems, and feel connected to the grandfather I'd barely known but who'd loved me unconditionally. On quiet Sunday afternoons, I'd sit in Harold's workshop reading his journals and business notes, learning about the man who'd seen potential in me when my own family saw only disappointment. His writings revealed a brilliant, compassionate person who'd built his empire not for personal glory, but as a foundation for helping others achieve their own success. Success without purpose is just elaborate selfishness, he'd written in one journal entry. I want Mitchell Hardware to prove that businesses can be profitable while also being forces for good in their communities. That philosophy had become the guiding principle for every decision I made as the company's leader. We measured success not just in financial terms, but also in terms of employee satisfaction, community impact, and customer loyalty. As I prepared to leave the office that evening, I reflected on the journey that had brought me from the corner chair in Mr. Thompson's office to the executive leadership of a $50 million business empire. Harold's inheritance process had given me far more than money or business ownership. It had given me the truth about my own worth, the opportunity to build meaningful relationships with people who valued honesty and integrity, and the chance to continue Harold's legacy of using business success to strengthen communities. But perhaps most importantly, it had taught me that family isn't defined by biology or obligation. It's defined by love, respect, and mutual support. I'd lost the family I'd been born into, but I'd gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that I deserved, better than manipulation and emotional abuse, and the strength to build a life based on my own values rather than others' expectations. 2 years after Harold's inheritance reading changed everything. I found myself kneeling beside his gravestone on a crisp October morning, sharing the news I knew would have made him proud. Mitchell Hardware had just been selected as the Pacific Northwest's Employer of the Year for our innovative profit-sharing programs and community development initiatives. "We did it, Grandpa." I whispered to the granite headstone engraved with his name and the simple inscription, "Harold Eugene Mitchell, he built more than businesses. The empire you trusted me with is everything you dreamed it could be." The cemetery was peaceful in the early morning light, and I felt the deep sense of connection with Harold that had been stolen from us during his lifetime, but had been restored through his remarkable final gift. His inheritance had given me more than financial security. It had given me the truth about myself and the courage to claim the life I deserved. Jessica approached quietly from the parking area carrying a bouquet of the yellow roses Harold had grown in his garden. She'd completed her restitution program 6 months ago and had accepted a position with our nonprofit foundation, where she coordinated business education programs for at-risk youth. "I brought these from his rose garden," she said softly, placing the flowers beside Harold's headstone. "They're still blooming beautifully. Mrs. Chen from next door has been taking care of them." We stood together in comfortable silence, two sisters who'd finally learned to base their relationship on honesty rather than competition. Jessica's transformation had been as dramatic as mine. She discovered that genuine accomplishment felt far better than unearned praise or stolen success. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if we'd told the truth from the beginning?" Jessica asked. "If Mom and Dad had let you and Grandpa have a real relationship?" I considered her question, watching a cardinal land on Harold's headstone as if listening to our conversation. "I think Harold and I would have been best friends," I said finally. "I think he would have taught me everything about business, and I would have learned to love building things with my hands in his workshop. And I think," Jessica added quietly, "I would have learned that I didn't need to steal love and attention because there was enough for both of us." Our parents had been transferred to different federal facilities after attempting to coordinate their appeals from prison. Dad had suffered a minor heart attack 6 months ago, which had apparently convinced Mom to finally accept responsibility for their crimes. She'd written me a letter. the first honest communication I'd ever received from her, apologizing for the damage they'd caused and expressing genuine pride in what I'd accomplished with Harold's legacy. I hadn't responded to the letter yet, but I hadn't thrown it away either. Forgiveness, I'd learned, was a process that couldn't be rushed or forced. Perhaps someday I'd be ready to have honest conversations with my parents about the harm they'd caused. But that day hadn't arrived yet, and I'd stopped feeling guilty about protecting my emotional well-being. The Cardinal flew away as Jessica and I prepared to leave the cemetery. We had a board meeting that afternoon to discuss our latest expansion into sustainable building materials, a venture that would create jobs while helping communities build more environmentally responsible homes and businesses. "Brandy," Jessica said as we walked toward our cars, "I know I can't undo the years of hurt we caused you, but I want you to know that watching you build something beautiful from Harold's legacy has taught me what real family love looks like." I hugged my sister, feeling grateful for the relationship we'd finally learned to build based on truth and mutual respect. Harold believed in redemption for people willing to do the hard work of change. I told her, "You've proven him right." As I drove to the office, I reflected on the profound life lesson Harold's inheritance had taught me. True family relationships are built on honesty and respect, not obligation and manipulation. When we allow others to define our worth or control our relationships, we lose ourselves. The courage to confront deception and demand truth is the foundation of personal freedom and authentic love. Harold's legacy had shown me that it's never too late to escape patterns of manipulation and abuse. Sometimes the people who claim to love us are actually preventing us from becoming who we're meant to be. And sometimes the greatest act of love is refusing to accept treatment that diminishes our worth. Mitchell Hardware now operated 31 stores across 4 states, employed over 600 people, and had become a national model for ethical business practices. But the company's success meant less to me than the knowledge that I'd honored Harold's vision of using business as a force for good in the world. Every day I worked with people who valued honesty, integrity, and mutual respect. Every decision I made was guided by Harold's principle that success without purpose is just elaborate selfishness. And every evening I went home to a life built on my own values rather than others' expectations. The little girl who'd hidden her science fair ribbon in a shoebox had grown into a woman who created opportunities for other people to shine. The daughter, who'd been told she wasn't worth investing in, had become a leader who invested in every employee's potential for growth and success. Harold's final gift hadn't just been financial inheritance, it had been the gift of truth. Truth about my worth, truth about what healthy relationships look like, and truth about the strength I'd possessed all along, but had never been allowed to recognize. As I settled into my office that afternoon, surrounded by the evidence of everything Harold's love and faith had made possible, I understood that some inheritances can't be measured in dollars. The most valuable legacy is the knowledge that we are worthy of love, respect, and the opportunity to build something meaningful with our lives. That knowledge, once gained, can never be stolen or diminished by those who seek to control us through manipulation and lies. I want to ask you something that really matters. Have you ever found yourself accepting less than you deserve from people who claim to love you? Sometimes the people closest to us can be the ones who damage our self-worth the most often, without us even realizing it's happening. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button to let me know it touched your heart. And if you've ever had to find the courage to stand up to family manipulation or demand the truth in difficult relationships, share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone else who's struggling with similar challenges. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories about finding strength in difficult family situations and learning to recognize your own worth. And please share this video with anyone who might need to hear Harold's message about the difference between real love and manipulative control. Thank you for taking this emotional journey with me today. Remember that you deserve relationships built on honesty, respect, and genuine love. Never settle for less than that, no matter who's offering the alternative. Until next time, keep believing in your own worth and fighting for the truth that sets you free.